Okay, so this slide presentation or lecture should be relatively quick. Basically, going to cover major events of World War II. I say it's quick because it's only a couple of slides. There's a ton of documentary on it. I may post something, but I do have documentary videos attached. And honestly, it might be better just to really focus in on the major events from reading the textbook and just kind of following trail of thought. Now, the war itself, um, if you could believe it, is more cataclysmic than World War One. Some of that having to do just with the technology that's advanced in the decades following World War One. So we're tanks and machine guns and airplanes were novelties in World War One. Now the idea of an aerial war is way more prevalent. And in fact, this is the whole blitzkrieg that the Germans would use as they just basically rushed through Europe, conquering countries left and right, including France. So as we also saw from last lecture, the Japanese had already been moving across Asia and conquering territory. This would set them up against the United States eventually, since the United States had interest in Asia. So if you look at this map here, we know that Pearl Harbor in December of 1941 is what gets America in the war. But already, as you can see here, Japan was moving quickly across all of Asia. And so you can see by 1942, shortly after the U.S. is already in the war, look at the territory that is controlled by Japan. This is one reason why Australia gets in the war, right? I mean, they're they're also threatened by Japan. With the Germans, it's a different story, right? Basically, Hitler is going to move into Poland in 1939 and take that. Now, before he did that, he had already brought in Austria. If you've ever seen the movie Sound of Music, that's the context for that. And he was moving in to take Czechoslovakia. And famously, the British and the French had handed Czechoslovakia on a silver platter to the Nazis so that they wouldn't, so that would kind of like appease Hitler. So that's that famous appeasement word that you might hear around. This is the Munich Agreement in 1938. Prior to this, the Spanish under Franco, the dictator Franco, who had ruled Spain until about the 1980s, um, they had gone to civil war. This is the Republicans versus the Nationalists. Nationalists are the fascists, and Franco would be a supporter of the Nazis and the Italians, um, but kind of a silent partner. Well, not directly intervening in the war. That's what I meant. Um, and also, so that was a big war. And Stalin, remember, Stalinism is communism in one country. He did not really give troops over to help out in this war. I mean, there's a lot of famous communists and Republicans, including like Ernest Hemingway, that were fighting with the Republicans against the fascists. So Spain is kind of seen as the playground before the war. And this is where Picasso would paint his famous Guernica painting. That's in the earlier part of my lecture title page. You can see, which just shows the devastation of aerial bombing on this small Spanish town. So, anyways, Hitler had also made a pact with Stalin called the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, late '39, right before World War II started. And he did this in order to like keep Russia at bay. So then Hitler and does the Nazis do the Blitzkrieg. France is captured, and a pro-Nazi government is installed. There is a resistance that fights back, but basically it's Britain that's left standing, and the Nazis do this major air campaign over Britain. um, and Britain is, begging for the U.S. to help. Why did the U.S. get in the war? Well, very much like World War One, the U.S. was tended to be isolationist. We helped. The U.S. helped with Lend Lease Act. So I mean, they were basically sending stuff to Britain on loan to fight this war. But it was with the Japanese that dragged the Americans in the war because of Japan's imperialism. The United States had put an oil embargo upon them, and the Japanese figured eventually the Americans would, intervene in Asia, and so they bombed Pearl Harbor as a preemptive strike. So U.S. is in. Right before that happened, Hitler surprised Stalin by invading Russia. So this is kind of where I see as like one of the mistakes. Um, that until like the Nazis did not take out Britain yet. Britain is still standing, and then they decide to go ahead and go against Russia and commit to Russia. So now the Americans are in, the Russians are in. So Britain has these two allies, among others, but the two major forces are going to basically determine the destiny of the world in the rest of the 20th century. The Americans and the Russians are now in the fight with Britain against the Nazis and the Axis powers. So this is where it gets all split up. The Japanese move against the Americans and the Allies. They take the Philippines, and remember, Philippines is an American colony at this point, more or less. And famously, the Bataan Death March happened in April '42. The Supreme American commander MacArthur escapes, and the Americans decide they're going to do what's called island hopping, and basically work their way through all these little. Go back to the map. Um, all these little islands across the Pacific. They're going to just basically bounce around until they can get mainland Japan. Um, so that's the plan. Midway, June of '42, this is the turning point of the war. This is what actually allows the Americans to island hop. So watch the video off to the side. What happens is the Japanese did not sink all the American fleet here at Pearl Harbor, and so Midway was their attempt to do that. But Midway actually ends up being where the Americans sink a number of the Japanese vessels, and so they have the numbers and the willpower to advance towards Japan. Now, so that's one section. The Americans are fighting in the Pacific. The Americans and the British are also fighting in Africa. Actually, to start the war, the Italians tried to take Ethiopia, the last one section of Africa that was not colonized, and so you have Italian and Germans in Africa fighting against the British and the Americans in this kind of tank war. And that's where the Germans are kind of overextended. They're overextended because here they're in Russia, right? So the Germans are in Russia, and then they're also here in Africa fighting this tank war. So they got the Eastern Front, the Americans fighting the Western Front over here in the Pacific. There is no Western Front in Europe, so this is where things change. In the Battle of Stalingrad, that's a turning point for the Eastern Front. Basically, that's the Stalingrad. I mean, the numbers. I mean, we're talking millions and millions of Russians who die in this war. If you look at the casualty count online, you'll see that it's heavily Russian. But they push back against the Nazis after Stalingrad. So what you get is basically Russia pushing the Germans back to Berlin. Eventually, the tank war is won down here by the British, the Americans, and so they're pushing north into Italy, and they'll take Italy and some of these other territories controlled by the Nazis or the Axis here, and then finally the big push on the Western Front is D-Day in '44. When they storm the beaches of Normandy. We've ever seen the movie Saving Private Ryan? That's where that's about. So basically, by '44, you have the Russians push this way. You have the Allies, led by the Americans, pushing this way. Beginning of 45, Christmas time of 44, you get the Battle of the Bull, which is kind of a last ditch effort by the Nazis to hold back the advance of the Allies. And eventually, the Russians will hit Berlin first and raid, pillage, all that stuff. Um, so by the middle of 45, Mussolini and Hitler are both gone. Germans surrender. In the meantime, at Yalta, the Stalin and FDR basically iron out plans for the post-war world, and then decide what we're going to do about the Pacific. So one reason why the Americans dropped both bombs is the Japanese were not surrendering. The battles around Okinawa and closer to Japan were just merciless. And so once they figured they have the capability to drop the bombs, they decided to do it. So the Potsdam Declaration was the Russians now getting involved in the Pacific War. So after the two bombs, the Japanese are then forced to surrender. So where does that leave us? Basically, it's a cataclysmic event. Millions and millions die. You have the discovery of the Holocaust that happened that you can watch in the video. And then basically it spells the end, as I mentioned earlier, of Europe kind of calling the shots in global politics. And now it's going to be the Americans and it's going to be the Soviet Union. So the battle of the Cold War is going to begin.